Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's another opportunity for us to learn with Port Jewish Center, and I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's talk with Jason Bell, who's the author of Cracking the Nazi Code. If I haven't introduced myself, if we don't know each other, I think most of us do. But my name is Rabbi Alyssa Mendelson Graff, and I'm the rabbi at Port Jewish Center. Welcome. So I'm thrilled to invite you to welcome you to this talk with Jason Bell. Let me tell you a little bit about our author. Dr. Bell has his PhD. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of New Brunswick. He has served as a Fulbright Scholar in Germany, the United States, and Canada. And he was the first scholar granted exclusive access to the British secret agent Winthrop Bell's classified espionage papers. And we are super lucky to have him here. He lives in Canada now. But he did grow up in our side of the border in Minnesota and some other places, I think, spent some time in Oklahoma and in Tennessee. And we're happy to welcome you to Long Island tonight, Dr. Bell. So I turn things over to you now.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Mendelson Graff, and to the Port Jewish Center for inviting me to address your community. So today I would like to do three things. So the first is I will read the prologue for my book, which introduces you to Winthrop Bell as a retired MI6 agent who's still doing pro bono intelligence work in the spring of 1939. The second part will give an overview of his life with attention to his intelligence career for MI6. Beginning in early 1919. And then the third part, I will be glad to have a conversation with you and to hear your questions and your thoughts and see what you're wondering about the book. So to begin with the prologue, on Sunday, March 19, 1939, Winthrop Bell opened his basement vault and stepped inside through an imposing green steel door designed for a bank. He lifted a file holding copies of still classified espionage reports he had written for the British Secret Intelligence Service 20 years earlier. He knew how to manage the risk. Sealed behind a massive lock, the papers were safe from thieves and Gestapo spies. In his hand were London's first warnings about the Nazis, written during his mission to Berlin. He locked the vault behind him and returned to his basement study. Because he had built the house on land sloping down to the harbor, the back wall was at ground level, with two sunny windows and a door opening onto the garden. He looked out one window and took in a commanding view of Back Harbor in Chester, Nova Scotia, Canada. Bell was half a world away from the Nazis' violent, racist Berlin. 20 years earlier, the Secret Intelligence Service, better known as MI6, had sent him on a classified mission to that dangerous city teeming with democratic heroes and terroristic villains. His assignment was to gather intelligence about the situation in the German capital, where people were still licking their wounds after their defeat in the First World War. Gradually, he had gathered threads of evidence, hints from sources, and interviews with aristocrats, politicians, bureaucrats, military officers, soldiers, scientists, and ordinary citizens. Woven together, he revealed a secret group with a dangerous plot. Now, 20 years later, the terrorists controlled Germany. Bell's democratic sources had been murdered, exiled, or were working underground. In 1919, some powerful British bureaucrats had been incredulous of Bell's warning. The Nazis were at the time attacking Jews from the shadows and weren't perceived as a threat. Officials decided to bury Bell's report under a restrictive top-secret classification rather than release it to the public as he hoped. 2 decades later, he still kept a copy in his vault. The other copy was stored in the Foreign Office's secret library. By the spring of 1939, the Nazis had grown strong enough to plot a war of revenge against the entire world. But they kept their plan and their ultimate purpose, the Holocaust as we now call it, as their most closely guarded secret. Bell was the first to decipher their code, just as he had been in 1919. He knew he needed to put his retirement on hold so he could thwart the Nazis once again. Bell added his 20-year-old intelligence reports to the stack of documents on his desk. Next to his typewriter lay a copy of Hitler's Mein Kampf in German and transcripts of recent speeches by leading Nazi officials. He picked up his pen to add to the notes he had drafted for what would be the world's first published warning of Hitler's plans for worldwide genocide. He flipped through the pages to the file from the vault until he found the words he had typed when he was secret agent A12. He translated the German shouts he remembered from listening undercover on the first secret Nazis in Berlin. Hatred, revenge, uncompromising enmity, these must be our watchwords. Then he reread the words he had shared with his 1919 readers, men and women with top secret clearance. They know very well that Germany is herself in no position to gratify this desire. The reactionaries know that their hour is not yet come. The more far-seeing would wait a long time yet. 2 decades later, Bell felt no better that he had been proven right. Now he needed to make up for lost time. Bell had not read Mein Kampf when it came out in 1925 because he was busy teaching philosophy at Harvard University. But once he brought his full intelligence to the Nazi Code in March 1939, reading between the lines of Mein Kampf and recent statements by leading Nazi officials, cracking it was surprisingly easy. Hitler could not come right out and say what he meant to do with conquered populations because it would provoke overwhelming opposition. So he and his leaders spoke in a secret language that made the plan clear to their fellow racists while leaving everyone else in the dark. For instance, Hitler cleverly pointed his followers to ancient historical examples in which conquerors had slaughtered defeated populations. Bell, as expert in history as he was in the German language, saw the implication that Hitler left unstated. By piecing together historical clues with other data, Bell deciphered a secret message that had fooled the world for 14 years. But revealing the Nazis' hidden intentions was the easy part. It remained a far greater challenge to convince others that the German Führer seriously meant to obliterate all non-Aryans and that the scope of his plan extended far beyond Germany and even Europe. It would be a difficult picture to paint. In late April, he was still at work writing his warning. His diary recorded him pruning trees and then listening to Weber's Oberon Overture, Haydn's Oxford Symphony, and Brahms's First on the radio. He made cocoa during the Brahms intermission, but distracted by his conversation with his wife, Brahms was vigorously played but too rushed in many places, he told her. He accidentally used salt instead of sugar. Then he sat back down to work, but once in a while he looked out at a heavy spring snow that made the view from his office beautiful. Eventually, he turned to his typewriter, which stood solemnly at the center of his desk. The repairman had visited on April 21st to ensure it was in top form. First rate again, Bell noted after months of wretched functioning. The tuned and oiled machine stood ready to fight the Nazis. He rolled a sheet of paper into position. The room transformed from silence to the machine gun fire of his practiced typing. In the spring before the war was launched, the murderous final solution to the Jewish question still had no name. The Führer described it only by hints and implications. Bell named it Hitler's extermination program, and its scope, he typed, was worldwide. This was the first clear warning of a strange fact that most people still do not realize today. Hitler and his allies meant to destroy all non-Aryan races on every inhabited continent of Earth. By the end of the Second World War, the Nazis had killed approximately 20 million innocent people, not including combat deaths. That was far short of the number they had hoped to kill. Even before the war began, Bell knew they aimed to massacre hundreds of millions. And yet, as the Holocaust historian Jürgen Matthäus notes, in September 1939, no one, not even seasoned observers of pre-war terror, had a clear idea what the Nazi regime's next step towards its goal of solving the Jewish question would be. And in her book, Beyond Belief, The American Press and the Coming of the Holocaust, Deborah Lipstadt shows there are no known earlier warnings about the final solution in English language newspapers. Before 1942, she explains, journalists understood Nazi extermination to mean deportations of Jews and occasional murders to frighten other Jews out of Germany. No one, she writes, could imagine even in 1941 that it would soon take on an even more diabolical meaning as the systematic and complete murder of European Jewry. And as Andrew Nagorski writes in Hitlerland, people had no inkling of the Nazi plan, even though today, he writes, it's conventional wisdom that Hitler's intentions were perfectly clear from the outset and that his policies could only result in World War II and the Holocaust. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, American visitors to Germany did not see Hitler's ultimate purpose. For those who met him, Nagorski writes, he was not some abstract embodiment of evil, but a real-life politician. But Bell knew. And he alone in early 1939 knew enough to give a startlingly accurate warning that Hitler meant to kill all Jews and non-Aryan peoples everywhere in the world. Agent A12's clear view, at a time when the Nazis proclaimed a desire for peace, no doubt owed to his close-up observation of the Nazis in 1919. He had seen their hidden essence months before Hitler was even a player in the movement. And now, 2 decades later, Bell realized that their race war would not stop with the Jews. Next on their hit list were peoples like the Poles, Ukrainians, French, Russians, Czechs, Slovaks, Asians, and Blacks. All non-Aryans, he typed, were to be quite literally exterminated. And that is an emphasis in the original, quite literally exterminated. This was, in Hitler's depraved imagination, the only way to protect German blood from racial poisoning. Hitler's European policy, Bell typed, is thus merely the first stage. Hitler planned to murder non-Aryans in North America just as surely as he meant to destroy them in Europe. Bell knew that if the Nazis won the war, SS troops would one day be in Nova Scotia to round up the Jews and other minorities, as well as liberals like him. But this time, unlike 1919, he had an important advantage. Now he was no longer a professional spy, but a private individual. No clueless government bureaucrats could censor him. So the second part of my talk is an overview of Winthrop Bell's his career as an intelligence agent, looking especially at the 1919 period, but also how it connects to some of his academic work at Harvard after that. One pivotal figure has remained unnoticed in World War II history until now. Recently declassified papers reveal that Dr. Winthrop Bell was key to winning World War II by providing the first warnings about the Nazis and thwarting their earliest battle plans. As an undercover operative in Germany, Bell gave the first warnings of the nascent Nazi ideology in early 1919. Months before Adolf Hitler was a player in the movement, Bell warned of Nazi plans for race war. In 1919, Bell described how the extremists planned to target Jews and team up with Russia and Japan to fight a war of revenge. His report was an eerily prescient warning of the birth of the Axis and the future consequences of failure to take immediate action to prevent it. 2 decades later, in spring 1939, Bell wrote the first intel alert of Hitler's plans for the Holocaust, and later that year published it in a leading Canadian news weekly, Saturday Night. It was the first warning by years. In 1919, Bell wanted to warn the West to eradicate the Nazis before they became powerful, but the plot he described seemed to some too incredible to be true. Still, his warnings were sufficient to raise the alarm among far-sighted people like the chiefs of MI6. Britain was sufficiently worried about the Nazis to rearm to counter them. Without Bell, the Nazis might have won the war. Nearly 6 feet tall, Bell was a handsome, blonde, blue-eyed philosopher, outdoorsman, engineer, and businessman. Before beginning his espionage career, he was a railway surveyor in the inhospitable northern Canadian forests and served on Emmanuel College's rowing team at Cambridge University. But he wasn't just muscles and rugged backstory. A New Brunswick newspaper described his amazing capacity for hard work and his studious, friendly, gracious, and attractive personality. The famous German philosopher Edmund Husserl called him brilliant. Bell was born in 1884 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and raised in a prosperous, academically inclined family. His father, owner of a successful ship outfitting business, was a genial, humble man who gladly stood against injustice. Winthrop's mother, a perfectionist unto exhaustion, studied music in Boston before teaching piano in Sackville. The parental tendencies to perfectionism, humility, geniality, musical appreciation, and righteous anger combined in their son. After graduating with honors from prestigious Mount Allison University in Sackville, in 1908, Bell came to Harvard to study philosophy with leading representatives of the pragmatic movement. The method taught a middle position between self-certain absolutism and skepticism. For pragmatism, the world is full of problems and thinking is designed to solve them. It was a lesson he took to heart when he became a spy. He was planning to become a philosophy professor at Harvard when he arrived at Göttingen, Germany in 1911 to become the first Anglophone doctoral student of Husserl, the renowned leader of phenomenology. Philosophy had been divided between the idealists, who think the important thing are the essences, and the empiricists, who think that the important thing are the appearances. Phenomenology showed how to get to the essential through the appearances. Bell was making his final dissertation revisions when Britain entered the Great War in August 1914. As a British subject, he was arrested. Still worse, his doctorate was withdrawn. But then things became much worse. Based on a misheard conversation, he fell under suspicion as a spy and was subjected to harsh interrogations. He was eventually judged innocent and ended up, like the other British civilian prisoners, in Ruhleben prison camp, a former horse racing track, where the men were housed in stables 6 to a horse stall and more above where the hay had been kept. Despite armed guards, barbed wire, mud, and crowded, noisy conditions, the camp had its upsides. The prisoners were allowed to organize themselves and use their own funds to import goods needed for camp shops, organize sports, cultural activities, and even a university. Because the prisoners included academics, musicians, and athletes caught in Germany at the outbreak of war, they created a thriving leisure scene with musical performances, drama, film, and competitive sports. Bell taught philosophy and history at Ruhleben Camp School. Distinguished institutions such as Oxford, Edinburgh, and the University of London later recognized Ruhleben credits. For a future World War II anti-Nazi intelligence agent, Ruhleben was like a 4-year espionage preparatory course paid for by the German government. It gave Bell opportunities to hone his German language skills and understand the nuances of the German mindset and political situation at a level of detail impossible in any other country. Living near Berlin also meant staying near friends with sensitive positions in German military intelligence. Interestingly, Bell was not the only Ruhleben inmate to end up with the Secret Service. His prison team hockey rival was John Cecil Masterman, who orchestrated the World War II double-cross operation that used double agents to convince Hitler that the D-Day invasion would happen at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. At war's end, amidst the revolution, Bell spent weeks in Berlin having conversations with his key sources. Through the sound of gunshots, he learned that despite political turmoil and Germany's starvation, the people were extremely hopeful about their democratic future. But dangerous forces lurked in the background, including powerful racist warlords like General Erich Ludendorff. Soon Bell was in London, where he met with the Canadian Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden, a family friend. Bell explained the German situation and told Borden a surprising fact, that a leading German faction under Ludendorff had fought the Great War as a race war. That faction had seized control of Germany in the latter part of World War I, but now, after the revolution, was marginalized, and the pro-democratic majority was in charge. But democracy was on unstable footing. Bell warned that democracy could not remain in power for long if conditions remained desperate. Militant communists and racist nationalists waited in the wings. Bell proposed a plan to secure friendly relations between Germany and the Allies to save democracy and starve the extremists of recruits. Borden made introductions, and MI6, Britain's Secret Service, soon wanted to hire Bell as an agent. But owing to post-war austerity, the Secret Service was virtually broke. The legendary C, MI6's chief and founder Sir Mansfield Smith Cumming, was needing to lay off many of his best agents who had risked their lives in the service. Fortunately, a solution was found. Canada, with its immense national resources, would cover Bell's salary, providing a handsome pay that would let him wine and dine Germany's most important citizens in style. The Canadian became Britain's newest secret agent. He was assigned cover as a Reuters reporter and sent to Berlin, a once orderly city now turned into a deadly web of intrigue. Communists, nationalists, and Democrats vied for the country's soul. Not one to do things by half measures, Bell took his cover job as journalist seriously. His dispatches went to both MI6 and to English language newspapers throughout the world. His risky trips to the telegraph office, sometimes sprinting through raging urban battles featuring airplanes, howitzers, and poison gas, gave readers a lifetime description of Germany's descent into madness. Some journalists, he complained, stayed safe in their luxurious hotels, writing stories based on propagandistic news releases. But Bell knew he needed to take the risk of getting shot or worse to deliver the unvarnished truth about German desperation. He wouldn't be able to convince Britain's political leaders to act unless their voting public was swayed. And it was still popular to be anti-German owing to resentment about the war. Bell's reports, informed by sources like the future Nobel Prize-winning physicist Albert Einstein, were key to finally ending the Allied food blockade of Germany that continued into 1919. A misnomer holds that the war stopped with the November 1918 armistice, but that was only a ceasefire. The violence continued, but with slow starvation of the German people rather than artillery fire. The blockade remained in place until March 1919, when Bell's firsthand description of starving children and desperate mothers helped turn the tide of public opinion. So he reported that something like 250,000 of Germans died after November, the armistice, and up to March 1919. But what Einstein, who had close connections with the German government, told him was that the food in Germany was about to completely run out, and then the death toll was going to turn into the millions. And that was the news that Bell was able to get to the public and to the government of Britain that reversed the blockade policy. Bell urged that extending a helping hand to German democracy was better than letting the country fall under the control of the extremists. Desperate economic conditions made for easy recruiting by extremist militias. Along with Borden and C, Bell had a growing number of allies in the quest, including the powerful British spy master Lord Maurice Hankey, influential figures at Versailles like Lord Robert Cecil, and directors of prominent financial institutions, including the Bank of England, Lloyds, and Barclays. Bell also swayed the UK Prime Minister David Lloyd George through personal briefings. After meeting Bell on March 26, 1919, the Prime Minister was converted to a more merciful plan for the Versailles Peace Treaty. Unfortunately, the American President Woodrow Wilson had a change of heart in the opposite direction towards France's proposal for harsh terms, leaving the vote 2-1 in favor of the harsh justice, the one vote belonging to the merciful group. Still, the British negotiators mitigated the punishment. For instance, after being briefed by Bell, Lloyd George shocked France and the United States by saying that if Germany refused to sign the draft treaty without changes, and the Allies invaded Germany in response, Britain would refuse to join them. The shift happened because Bell's intel had given Lloyd George a considerable fright. Not amending the draft treaty, Bell explained, would mean immediate war. If German Silesia, among the country's richest land, were handed over to Poland, as the draft treaty planned, war would begin right away. But there was an easy way to keep the peace. Bell urged letting Silesians vote on which country they wanted to join, Germany or Poland. Who could argue against democracy? France finally relented and the vote was scheduled. Bell's idea prevented a war that could have killed hundreds of thousands, and as the political intelligence department of the Foreign Office later said, it would have meant the end of Poland as a state. In the spring of 1919, with the help of his pro-democratic sources and German military intelligence, Bell described the birth of Nazi ideology. The reactionary right and elements of the Soviet left joined forces as National Socialism with the reactionaries in the driver's seat. The unholy marriage happened at the Eden Hotel, headquarters of the violent right-wing Freikorps forces. Before the negotiations at Eden, mediated by the German spymaster Baron von Schenk, militant nationalism and communism had been at each other's throats and democracy stayed in charge. But together, the extremists were the strongest military force in the country. Hitler's National Socialist German Workers' Party, named in early 1920, was merely a step in the plot, not its origin. In late 1919, Germany's situation became still more dire. By the fall, Bell warned that the Nazis were the strongest organization in Germany and could take over the country anytime they wanted. They just didn't want to yet because the country's economic position was hopeless. In October, Bell uncovered ambitious Nazi attack plans against Riga, Latvia, the gateway to the Baltics, with a 100,000-man army. He alerted Britain, which sent warships to bombard the invaders. Meanwhile, Bell cooperated with Germany's democratic authorities to defund the mercenaries and block arms transfers to the east. The Baltic invasion was led by high-ranking German anti-Semitic officers. This gave Britain the impression that it was an official government plot. If so, the Allies had reasons to restart the blockade and the war. But Bell intercepted a message written by a mercenary officer, proving it was a reactionary faction behind the attack, not the official German government. The defeat of the Nazis at Riga was one of MI6's greatest victories. Yet, in the clandestine style favored by the Secret Service, it was so quietly effective that it has gone virtually unnoticed in history. And here I should mention the New York Times, contemporaneous with this invasion, said that if these marauding right-wing groups won in Eastern Europe, the lives of 2 to 4 million Jews were at risk of murder. So the mass murders of Jews had already begun. Something like 100,000 were killed in Ukraine alone. And the New York Times reported that if the pro-democratic forces fell, the slaughter of Jews would continue wholesale. So despite thwarting the Baltic invasion, Bell realized that the Nazis wouldn't stop until they won or were utterly destroyed. He created a two-part plan to destroy them at their home base in Berlin. The military side was comparatively easy, helping German democracy disband the powerful militias. The financial side would be more difficult. Bell's plan would create a partnership among the Allies, neutral nations, and private financiers to supply credits so that German industry could restart. That in turn would create work for millions of unemployed soldiers who were otherwise being hired as mercenaries. Profits from German industry would mean tax revenue to fund German democracy. Those credits could then be repaid with interests, and investors would make a fortune. The world's economy would be placed on firm footing, and Germany would become a close friend of Britain. Yet, despite support from prominent quarters in official Britain, influential conservatives like the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Austen Chamberlain, blocked Bell's proposal. Chamberlain complained that Germany's credit would be spent buying materials from the United States. It was a jealous pang to the empire's conscience. Chamberlain's refusal meant continued instability, paving the way for the Nazi rise to power. And yet Bell's warning of a secret German army ran in English-language newspapers all over the world, just as with his warnings of a growing anti-Semitic movement in Germany. The warning helped Britain be more wary than their neighbors during the Nazi rise to power. One of the key moments, Winston Churchill, the future Prime Minister of Britain, was an avid reader of intelligence reports. He received Bell's intelligence in early 1920, late 1919, a warning of this large secret army, and Churchill brought that before Parliament in early 1920, saying that Germany had something like 1 million men in these militias, right-wing militias, heavily armed, including artillery and things like this, while the British military was on its way to only having 250,000 troops. So Britain was going to be outnumbered more than 4-1 once the official German military was counted, unless they started rearming to counter the threat. But frustrated by the inaction about his report in the first month of the year, Bell resigned his Secret Service position in early 1920. In 1922, Dr. Bell took up a position as philosophy instructor at Harvard and married Hazel Deinstadt, a fellow Nova Scotian and former war nurse in France. Owing to prudent investments and careful saving, he retired from teaching and business pursuits before the age of 50. The Bells moved to Chester, Nova Scotia, and a life of service and contemplation. In 1934, as Hitler seized absolute power in Germany, Bell undertook his next intelligence mission into Germany. This time it was a mission for two. Hazel went with him. In Göttingen, Bell met often with his top anti-Nazi source, Wilhelm Runge, a chief scientist in Germany's world-leading military radar program. Runge is a crucial but hitherto unnoticed figure in the Nazi defeat. Beginning with the Nazi rise to power and continuing through World War II, he used his leadership position to undermine Nazi radar from within. His sabotage transformed a seemingly insurmountable Nazi radar lead before the war into a debacle by the end. Because radar superiority made a fundamental difference in the Battle of Britain, the value of his operation is virtually incalculable. In the spring of 1939, Bell cracked the Nazis' secret plan for racial extermination and sent the revelation to his intelligence contacts. Later that year, the News Weekly Saturday Night published Bell's warning under the headlines, "Exterminate Non-Germans, Dogma of Mein Kampf," and "Hitler's extermination policy is worldwide." Bell understood the Nazis meant to kill all non-Aryans, including Jews, Slavs, blacks, and Asians everywhere in the world. Hitler's European policy, he wrote in Saturday Night, is merely the first stage. Bell's Holocaust warning was the earliest by years. The next appeared in secret intelligence files in 1941 and in the press in 1942. Hitler's plan required utmost secrecy, but Bell was the first to lift the veil. It is difficult to precisely calculate the impact of Bell's 1939 warning, but we know that among the intelligence contacts he alerted early in the year was his American friend Francis Dayock, who was a principal figure in the Pond, predecessor organization of the CIA. The US executive branch, despite congressional opposition, contributed to British defense in the early stages of the war during America's official neutrality, which may have owed to Bell's early warning, and Bell was a point person in that trade. So Bell would come to DC to help arrange for the shipment of arms to Canada and then to Britain, despite Congress having made that illegal, and that was done by basically concealing the purpose of the arms exports. And likewise, about Bell's warning, something similar can be said about the policy of demanding Germany's unconditional surrender during the war. Asking for surrender without conditions would, in ordinary times, be inhumane. But the Nazi plot for worldwide genocide left no alternative. After the war, Bell retired once again and took up writing history and reading detective stories. It was fitting leisure for one of history's greatest secret detectives. He died in Chester on April 4, 1965, in his home by the sea. Thanks to archives, his story did not die with him. It is a profound reminder of the truth spoken by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks: the hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews, and a reminder of the need to stand with Israel today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm going to turn things over now to questions, because I know there are probably people chomping at the bit to ask some. And so I'm going to go first to Marcia and Mark.
Hi, thank you much for writing this book. It was remarkable. I thought I knew a lot about this period, and there was so much in this book that I had no clue about. That that they were already plotting that World War I was a race war, like way in advance of pre-Hitler, pre-Nazis. I mean, all of that. And your amazing research here, it shows that, that Bell was kind of like the Forrest Gump or the Zelig. He seems to be like everywhere that mattered in between the war and after. And the fact that he was so visionary, that he could see so clearly how things were playing out that, well, the leaders didn't see. So I guess my question is, I know you mentioned in the book that some of his academic training and study of philosophy and all, but what are the factors that led him to become such a visionary spy? I mean, to be such a good spy and to be so able to see through all this facade to what was really going on beneath the surface.
Sure, I think there was a few things. So one of them was the academic study of phenomenology. So I mentioned Edmund Husserl, a Jewish philosopher who taught that we can discover essences through careful attention to appearances, and how that was a unique at the time philosophical position. Now it's it's become quite influential. But that was the method that Bell took on as an academic philosopher, and that he was able to use as an intelligence agent. So he's going out, he's looking through the appearances and asking what unites all these different things that are going on, and this is how he's discovering this plot. Another key factor, and this was totally innocent on his part, but he was just a tremendously friendly person. People really liked him and trusted him. He was loyal. And so these friends that he had made at Göttingen, so this was the premier math and science university in Germany at the time, where a lot of quantum theory took off, where Einstein lectured before he was famous. And his friends, among them these future Nobel Prize winners, including Max Born, those people were recruited into German military intelligence during World War I. Many of them were Jewish. And they were getting cleared out of the German military in 1919 as the racists were taking over. But they were able to give him a kind of a lifetime portrait of what this looked like. He was turning around and reporting this to the press. So again, he wasn't friendly for the sake of being a spy. He was friendly before he was a spy, and he made these friends before he was a spy. But then he had access to these extremely valuable sources before they got kicked out. But then he knew people like Wilhelm Runge, who was not Jewish, and so he was able to. So Runge was able to stay in the military and get these influential positions. Runge was a very liberal, fellow, small L liberal, and he worked for a Jewish boss at Telefunken, the company that basically invented radar, and resented the Nazis as they were clearing out Jewish ownership, and Runge just kept on feeding intelligence to Bell. And this Runge was somebody who was trusted by the Nazis up until the end. And then the third factor is this guy was just an astoundingly hard worker. So his diary talks about when he would go to sleep and when he would wake up. Oftentimes he's working until 3 or 4 in the morning, and then waking up 2 hours later during his espionage career. And there are times when he talks about how he'll wake up asleep on his desk or with his face on his typewriter. So he was just really, for those months that he was over there, working himself into an early grave is kind of what it amounted to. And he actually did end up causing himself heart troubles with his extreme work schedule. But what that meant was he was having meetings with leading journalists, with leading politicians, with industrialists, with all these different people that was letting him piece together the story. And if he had been more relaxed, I don't think he would have been able to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia and Mark. I'm going to turn things to Mark Menzer for the next question.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. It's a great read. I'm most of the way through it, not all the way through it, but the descriptions are wonderful. I've learned so much about particularly the period between the wars. But I'd like to hear a little bit about how you wrote the book. So, for instance, how much of the facts that you got came from those boxes that you found at Mount Allison University? How much was research that you had to do outside of that? Did you visit the places? You must have, the way they're described. If you could talk a little bit about that process, I'd be interested.
Sure. So the beginning part of this was at Mount Allison, and so there are copies of a lot of what he wrote. Not everything. So some of these things were unfortunately destroyed in a fire in Halifax in the 1920s, but a lot of his intelligence reports survived. But these are typically in a handwritten form. So early in the year, he was doing this all handwritten. Later on, MI6 provided him with a telephone service, so he telephoned them in, and then they were typed up, and then sent to him. So that was the core of the research. Then I went to Britain, to the parliamentary archives, which hold the Prime Minister's papers. I went to the National Archives, which has the War Cabinet's papers, and to Cambridge, which has some of these spy masters. And so there you can see how Bell's reports were being collated, summarized, and who they were going to. So you can see, for instance, that his reports were going to Winston Churchill. You can't tell that at Mount Allison. You just see the kind of the raw intel data. So Borden, the Prime Minister of Canada, during the time that he was in England, was personally handing Bell's reports directly to prime ministers. So he was handing it to the Prime Minister of England, of South Africa, of other nations, to the whole War Cabinet, and kind of forcing them to read it, so to speak. And so that's the kind of evidence that you can get in the archives in Britain. So in other words, you don't find anything in Britain that's totally original. There's always copies of it in the Mount Allison archives, but you can see kind of how it's collated and organized. And one of the other interesting things I found in Borden's papers was that in David Lloyd George's papers, the Prime Minister of England, was that the Canadian Prime Minister had handed to the United Kingdom in spring of 1919 a warning written by the Winnipeg Jewish community of the genocides that were going on in Europe at the time. And so this was right as Bell was being hired onto MI6. And so it seems pretty clear that this was one of the things that he was tasked with discovering the roots of. So the Winnipeg Jewish community was reporting that these anti-Jewish attacks had begun in Germany and then had spread throughout all of Europe, from Finland to the Far East. But they didn't know who in Germany was leading it. So Bell's reports from very early in the year were trying to investigate who was causing this to happen. So yeah, it's really a remarkable set of documents, and I was thanking my lucky stars all through the COVID pandemic that I had done the research the year before COVID started. So of course, once COVID started, all the archives were shut down, and I couldn't have done this work. But instead, I was comfortable in my office looking through my scans and and happy to be really to have a go at it. But it's absolutely fascinating materials. And very valuable, I should say, to intelligence history, because very little exists of secret intelligence reports from this period. So MI6 has burned all the records from that period. You don't find MI6 archives. So this has been as much of a revelation to the intelligence community as to people interested in World War I and World War II history. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
So I'll turn things to Nancy Solomon for the next question.
I have a lot of background in historical research, and I was just really amazed at what you just described, gaining access to these materials. How did you find out about them, and how did you find out about Bell?
Well, it was a kind of a funny story. And I was talking with Rabbi Mendelssohn Graf at the beginning of this. It really was related to pure luck of where I happened to study. So I studied at Oklahoma City University, where they were interested in interpreting between phenomenology and pragmatism. So German phenomenology and American pragmatism. And I just picked this up as what a person should be doing. And then I went to Vanderbilt and I started reading Husserl seriously, and I just thought there's no way all these similarities to pragmatism could be a mere coincidence. There had to be some kind of mutual readership. And so as I was finishing my PhD, I went to Göttingen on just kind of a fishing expedition, so to speak, to see what Husserl had been reading. And that's when I found Winthrop Bell's unpublished dissertation that explained the pragmatist to the phenomenologist. So it was purely a philosophical mystery I was trying to solve. And then bizarrely, the dissertation at Göttingen was missing 2 pages. And I found that Winthrop Bell's papers were housed at Mount Allison University, but they were under restriction. And at the time, I had no idea why they were under restriction. I didn't even hazard a hypothesis about this. But I wrote a letter to the president of Mount Allison and I asked for those restrictions to be lifted. He wrote back a couple weeks later and he said, okay, they've been lifted, you can come in. I subsequently learned that Mount Allison checked in with Britain's Foreign Office to confirm that these materials were now declassified. So they were like a lot of things in intelligence, they kind of stay classified until somebody asks for for it to be lifted. So I went into Mount Allison and immediately saw within the first couple of days that he'd worked as a British spy. But to make a frank confession that was just kind of like, oh, that's interesting. And I got back to the philosophical work. It was a few years later that I started really reading his intelligence reports and was aghast at what was contained in them. That there were these warnings of this race war going on, and then I kind of had to shift my hat. So I did a serious work for a few years, publishing Bell's work in philosophy. And then, once I kind of got satiated with that, I turned around and I seriously got into the intelligence stuff.
And any comment, Nancy, or you're muted? So, or are you just in awe?
I just know that, whenever I finished a project, it's like, damn, I should have written about that. I was wondering if that may have happened to you.
It's funny. If I could go back in time, I would have done it in the reverse order. I would have started with the with the espionage stuff and then done the philosophy stuff later. Although I'm kind of happy that I did it like I could I did, because in a funny way I've kind of gotten like kidnapped by the intelligence community. So they know now, or ask me to write this, that, and the other thing. And so it's harder for me to do kind of the pure theoretical work in philosophy now, but so I'm glad I did it when people were not paying attention.
It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I'm only halfway through, but it's just makes you pause on what could have been if they had listened.
Yep. And I mean, just to add to that, I mean, I think it could have been worse. And there were people in Britain who did listen. And, Britain and Winthrop Bell was explaining this to some of his friends during World War II, that he said, Britain's gotten a bad rap for not standing up to Hitler earlier. But he said, when they did stand up to Hitler, they were the first ones to do it. And some of the people who were involved with advising Chamberlain at Munich, which Bell said was, them drawing a line in the sand and saying, if you cross this, we'll fight you. Those were the current head of MI6 at the time, Stuart Menzies, who was one of the people that Bell had personally briefed in 1919. So the British were nervous about the Germans at a time when the rest of the world really believed Hitler, when Hitler said he was a pacifist and all he wanted was peace, etc. So yeah, it could have been better if they listened to him more, but it could have been worse if he hadn't been there.
Thank you, Nancy, for your question. And I'm going to turn things over now for the next question to Mitchell.
Thank you for writing this book, Dr. Bell, and for giving this presentation. And I guess to kind of follow up a bit on that prior question, I found it very interesting and intriguing that you and Winthrop Bell share this background in philosophy. And I'm wondering if that particularly gave his story a resonance to you personally. And also, if I understood correctly, it seemed like at one point you were suggesting that a background in philosophy could provide very helpful tools to spies. And did I understand that correctly?
Like, absolutely. Yeah, this is yeah, so I've been trained academically in pragmatism and phenomenology, what Winthrop Bell was as well. In his intelligence reports, you can very much see these moves that the pragmatists were making, that the phenomenologists were making, among them is just so phenomenology, as Husserl said it, is the fundamental first step is getting over bias, to see the things in themselves, as Husserl put it. And Bell, in his intelligence reports, is telling his bosses, we need to see the thing itself. So this is, it's phenomenology shop talk. That's kind of as close as you ever get to it. But the notion is that it's very easy for people to bring preordained abstractions to bear on the problem. And what that meant was other intelligence agents who were going into Germany after Winthrop Bell, so he was the first one in, the ones who went afterwards were really thinking of this as exclusively as a problem of capitalism versus communism. They had that kind of abstraction built into their mind. They saw themselves as being at war with communism. And Bell was saying, you need to really understand what's going on in Germany, which is the communists here have nothing to do with Moscow. They love London. They want democracy. They don't want any Moscow takeover. You're fighting the wrong people. If you make friends with these social democrats, they can support they can support democracy. But in order to understand what's going on, you have to get rid of your bias and understand this thing in itself. And then from pragmatism, it's along with and this is I mean a difference maybe in modern day intelligence, where you have people collecting the information, analyzing the information, giving advice, are all different people. Bell was kind of a one-stop shop. So he's collecting the information, he's analyzing it, he's giving advice, and he's pragmatically trying to solve the problems. And I'd mentioned earlier, I've scare quote been kidnapped by the intelligence community. I don't mean for real. I've never had a bag placed over my head or anything like this. But there are people who are trained philosophically who want to promote Winthrop Bell as a figure for what philosophy can do, and right now philosophy is kind of the in third place behind people who even maybe in fourth place is kind of history, political science, psychology are kind of the front three, philosophy is kind of behind. I like to say philosophy can be a good model because of its holism. I'm trying to promote this. I'm somebody who has no top secret clearances, but with what I can do when I'm writing white papers for the government or whatever, I try to show how Winthrop Bell is a good model for what a philosophical education can do. And I think this really goes back to to people like Socrates. So Socrates was somebody who did what I think we could now describe as military intelligence work. He was a soldier. But he was also somebody who thought about, Socrates thought about post-war peace, how to establish these conditions where you can make friends with people who want to be friendly and still fight the people who need to be fought. And I think it's a really valuable model, and it's hard to hold on to that when you're fighting somebody, you can really just want to hate them and want to destroy them. But this model of trying to find out what's good about a people and connect with that let Bell be able to escape a lot of the anti-German bias of his day. He was able to find the good people in Germany who wanted democracy who were liberally tolerant, who wanted a Germany that respected and celebrated different races. Those people existed, but it was hard for a lot of people in Britain and America to listen to them because they just thought of all of Germans as being bad people. So I think there's a basic orientation towards peace and philosophy that's still realistic about the need to fight, but its ultimate teleology is looking for a peaceful outcome, and I think that's absolutely a model that's useful today.
Thanks, Mitchell. I think we have one more question, and I'm pretty sure it's coming from Mark. So I'm going to turn things over to you, Mark, for the next question.
Hi, and thanks for writing that. I've also read a lot about this period, and there was a lot of jaw-dropping stuff in there. So I'd like to dig deeper on one point you made. In the post-war period, the Germans felt like victims, as you said, and the French and the British tended to blame them for starting the war. And you seem to agree with the fact that the Germans started the war. But first of all, I've read a lot of historians who feel that the war just kind of was an inevitable thing waiting to happen based on a single spark. And also in America, in the post-war, Americans did not feel that way. I mean, they actually felt they'd been kind of duped. There was a whole Belgian baby thing, and the Germans killed babies, which turned out not to be true. And the Americans did not feel that way. So, number one, if you could expound a little bit more on, and I think your book does cover it quite a bit, but I guess more, why historians don't seem to think that the Germans started this as much as your book seems to make the case of. And number two, why the American reaction was so different from the British and the French.
You said why the American reaction was so much different than the British and the French. Okay, sure. So yeah, as to the first point, so I mentioned in the book that Winthrop Bell knew a professor of mathematics at Göttingen, whose family had all kinds of diplomatic connections, and Winthrop Bell was thinking in 1914 of getting out of the country, and this professor advised him, no, this is all going to blow over. Diplomats are working on this. And historically, that's a lot of what survives is the story of German diplomats who are trying to avoid the war. Now, what Bell knew from his inside sources, and this is kind of like new stuff in the book, this was from his intelligence reports, is that so Bell's sources in 1919, among them Karl Kautsky, who was a social democratic politician journalist, was investigating how the war had started, and Kautsky learned that a lot of the documents from the military had been destroyed. So on the military side, and Kautsky reasoned from this that these were destroyed because it had proved Germany's guilt in starting the war. So what had basically happened is in the days leading up to the war and the bombing of Serbia, et cetera, like all the diplomats are trying to prevent this from getting any worse. All of these papers survive, and then it seems kind of like the war, like we stumbled into war. But what we learn from the Kautsky story that's being told to Bell, and Bell's reporting this to MI6, and it also gets through to Reuters, is that the German generals had these battle plans on the shelf for cutting through Belgium to make an end run around France. And France at this point, in the days leading up to the invasion, their diplomats were desperately trying to stay out of the war. And Germany was basically asking the French to do absurd backflips in order to avoid the war that were logically impossible. So they were telling the French, if you don't get Russia to stop mobilizing, we're going to attack you. Of course, France had no ability to control what Russia was doing. As Russia mobilized, Germany launches a sneak attack on France through Belgium. So fundamentally what happened is Germany in the early days of the war launches a sneak attack on Luxembourg, and they launch a sneak attack on Belgium, both of them neutral nations. And still at that point, Britain and France were trying to avoid war. So they gave Germany several days to withdraw. Germany did not withdraw, but nobody fired, shots at them first. Now I would just say, any police officer who saw something like this happening would immediately be able to lay blame, right? If one person pulls out a gun and you start shooting, bodies are falling for a few days. You wouldn't blame the victim at that point. I think, I think in terms, I teach military ethics and just war theory, and to my mind, this is as clean cut as you could possibly get. You invade two neutral nations to start a war. People ask you politely to withdraw. They give you a deadline. You refuse to do it. We can say at that point, Germany's guilty. On the other side, I think right. So there were was this propaganda about German war atrocities. Some of it was true. It wasn't about killing Belgian babies, but the Germans did massacre Belgian civilians during the early part of the war that they thought might later on become revolutionaries, and so to preempt it, they killed them. They were using Belgian civilians as human shields and things like that. So there were war atrocities going on. In the press, this gets it gets turned into propaganda, and it turns worse than it was. I think fundamentally, the difference between America and the rest of the world, and I'm writing a book now about OSS secret operations in World War II in Hungary. And you find in a similar way in America during World War II, there was a tremendous sympathy for Hungarians that simply did not exist in Britain. And likewise, in America, you had a tremendous sympathy for Germans, and it was because America was accepting vast numbers of these immigrants. So there were a lot of Germans in America. There were a lot of Hungarians in America, and so it was much easier to be sympathetic to that position. And that was very much the position that that Woodrow Wilson took with him to Paris. It was the 14 points were a shocking new thing under the sun, saying that we should merely oppose German militancy, and we should be friendly to German culture at a moment when the French and British just wanted to really wreak some havoc and get some and punish these people. And the British newspapers were in the early days after the war unanimous. We really need to punish these people, and David Lloyd George was. And then Wilson comes in with this shocking and to European eyes naive idealism about befriending these recent enemies. And the real tragedy, I think, is we don't have definitive proof of this, but some scholars have suggested it, that Wilson had an undiagnosed stroke after he got to Paris, and he simply stopped being able to defend his position. And that was about when Winthrop Bell convinced the British to adopt it. So basically, Wilson started becoming obsessed with furniture and cars, and he stopped thinking about politics. And his doctor said there was some serious illness that overcame him. But that was good old-fashioned, Democrats thinking about the electorate. Who was the electorate? And among them were millions and millions of Germans who did not want to think of their homeland as being just a nasty, brutal place. But one of the things that Winthrop Bell was really explaining was German public opinion was very different and distinct from the German military class, the Junkers, who are the ones who are really calling the shots. And again, I think that's why this has kind of misled historians. You see all this diplomatic evidence by people with fancy positions and their ministers, et cetera, trying to stay out of the war. But the real inner core of German life at that moment, the ones who were calling the shots, were the Prussian military class. And these were people who made these decisions and agreements in the casinos they hung out in. So there's not the same paper trail. But we can see, I mean, it's not just Winthrop Bell speculating at that point. It's him talking to people in 1919 who were inside sources in Germany, and some of them later that year were getting killed. They were getting assassinated in the streets. So this was a group that was protecting itself by killing its enemies already from 1919.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You can hear.
Hi, so I want to thank you. I don't know. I guess if you're at a university, maybe you're Professor Bell and Dr. Bell, but I just want to thank you so much for being with us. And I think I don't even know what to say except thank you for all of the work that you put into creating, writing this book, and the research and the thought. And I'm just looking at everyone on the screen, and I think there's a consensus that you've done something extraordinary, and we really appreciate just being able to spend an hour with you and to learn from you. You're very lucky students. I want to remind everyone that the book is called Cracking the Nazi Code by our Jason Bell. And if you look, Marcia's holding it. Marcia, let me just add you to the screen so you could put it here. So that's the cover of the book. So you can order it on Amazon, pick it up at your local bookstore. I just want to say thank you again to everyone. Professor, thank you so much for teaching us tonight. We are honored to be your students, and friends. That brings us to the end of our program. Don't forget to go to the chat and click on the link so that you can buy the book and register for talks in the future. Good night, everyone, and thanks so much for being with us.
Good night.